Hi, everyone. We have already 60 people online, so thanks everyone for joining. If you want to present yourself in the chat, maybe say hello, who you are, where you're tuning in from, and if you're also hit by this heat wave right now, if you want to share the temperature, maybe in London, Berlin, I think in Paris, like 32 degrees. Everyone's kind of dying here. So hopefully it's better where you are. And we're going to wait for a couple of minutes to allow people to log in. Can see people typing. Hi, Greg. USA, early riser. We are going to have 3 amazing speakers today. They will shortly present themselves, but we're very excited to be talking about this topic today, talking about equity. Hi, Theo from Paris. Hi, Sylvain. A lot of French people so far. Laura from Berlin, Raphael from Paris, Anise, France, remote, SF, Munich. Yes, Switzerland. That's Leggy.
Yes.
Alex from Berlin, SF again. Well, thank you everyone for taking the time to present yourself. We're gonna get started just now. So just to give you just a little, just to know how Livestorm works so that we're all set before really starting. So as you can see, there's a chat tab. You can use it to present yourself or comment. If you have any questions, there's a question tab on the right too. We will be taking questions since the start, but we will be also having a more formal Q&A at the end. And there's also a polls tab where we'll be sending some polls from time to time to gather feedback, have benchmarks, and see what others are doing. So let's get started. So my name is Christine. I help manage CFO Connect. So for those who are new to CFO Connect or are joining us for the first time, CFO Connect is a global community of finance leaders, and we have chapters in Europe and in the US. So really the idea behind CFO Connect is to allow finance leaders to connect, share ideas, challenges, and really network. And CFO Connect was created by Spendesk, and Spendesk is a spend management platform. So today, we're going to talk about equity. So equity is definitely a hot topic for startups, scale-ups, and it's a topic that's not that common in Europe. It's much more widespread in the US. And really the goal today is to talk about equity, to learn more about how it works, and really the why, the how. And today we have 3 great experts to talk about the subject. I will let them introduce themselves, but they're tuning from all around the world, which is pretty exciting and really couldn't have been possible if it wasn't for a live event. So thanks lockdown, COVID for that. So Yoko, if you can start presenting yourself, that would be amazing.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for this introduction, and also thanks to you and CFO Connect for organizing this great event. So my name is Yoko Spirik. I'm one of the co-founders of Leggy. And what we do with Leggy, in a couple of short sentences, is we're an equity management platform for startups. And we're currently used by many large scale-ups in Europe, such as, for example, WeFox or Musician or NAKD from Sweden. And essentially what we do is, I think, 2 main things. And that is, the first thing is we help startup leaders with managing ownership at scale, meaning, for example, good for this topic today, managing hundreds of employee participation plans with individual vesting schedules and so on. So that's the first thing we help with. And the second thing we help startups share information and collaborate with people who own them, who own the startups, so meaning employees and investors. So typical example is we can help with, for example, gathering exercising requests for stock option holders in a central way, so you can collaborate with all your employees. And yeah, maybe last thing here, also I think for us as a company, it's really close to our heart and close to our mission to democratize equity, especially here in Europe. And so really great to be here today.
Thanks, Yoko. Frank, you want to go next?
Sure, happy to. Thanks for having me. So my name is Frank, CFO co-founder at Raisin, a Berlin-based fintech that is actually offering retail investors all across Europe access to the best yielding savings products from banks all across Europe. That is all deposit insured, from instant savings accounts to 10-year fixed term bonds. We also offer investment solutions. We're doing this since 2012, and we've actually gathered more than 250,000 in customers who've brokered almost 25 billion in assets via the platform. And to close up the round, Index Ventures has been one of the first institutional investors in Raisin, backing us since the early days. And we are, as of today, a proud user of Spendesk in our expense management. And I'd hope, even though it steals me a bit of negotiation thunder, also at some point in time in the very near future using Ledgy. So that's how I came here, and I'm passionate since day one on the equity side of things. So I'd love to share a bit of the observations and obstacles that we're seeing as a scale up, and what we would hope for policymakers to address in the years to come to make this an even hotter topic going forward.
Great, thanks, Frank. Dominique?
Hi, thanks, Faustine. So Dominic Jackerson, I've been at Index Ventures for 8 years as the VP Talent and Insight. So just a few words about Index Ventures. We're a multi-stage, multi-sector VC fund, which started in Europe, actually born in Geneva, but now we operate pretty evenly, 50-50 split across Europe and the US. We have about 160 investments in total. We have over 6 billion euros under management. Our sweet spot is a Series A investment, but we also invest at seed. We also have a growth fund, so we can do follow-up investing. Just to give you a sense of like notable exits over the last couple of years would include Slack, Dropbox, Adyen, Datadog, and iZettle. Current investments would include Revolut, Deliveroo, Discord, Ala, and as Frank said, Raisin, and also Spendesk. So we're investors in both Raisin and Spendesk. So it's a little bit of nepotism here, but hi, Yoko. When did you most recently speak to us? So my role at Index is to support our portfolio companies on all things related to talent in the broadest sense. So that's obviously hiring, but also org design, internationalization, and a lot around compensation. I've written a couple of books whilst I've been at Index as well, and I'm just finishing off a third one at the moment, actually, just based on what I've learned and that privileged access I've got through our portfolio. So one of these was actually called Rewarding Talent. So actually, I just took up a copy. So it's actually a physical book, which is a guide to using employee stock options aimed at European entrepreneurs and startups. It is actually freely available in totality on our website as well, on the Index Ventures website. And it also gave rise to, we helped to kick off a campaign, a policy campaign called Not Optional, which is aimed to encourage European governments to make the stock option schemes more favorable as a way of supporting the European tech ecosystem. So that's something also very involved with now. That's it.
Great, that's awesome. We will be sharing the links that Dominique just talked about. And so to start, I'm gonna ask a simple question to Dominique. If you had one sentence to describe what equity is, what would it be?
One sentence, oh my gosh. Well, just mechanics is, equity, we use it interchangeably with stock options, but yep. it isn't the same. But I think most of the audience will appreciate that, given who they are. But we're talking about stock options. We can say employee equity otherwise, but they give employees the right, but not the obligation, to purchase shares in the company at a point in time in the future, but based on a valuation based on today's pricing when they're awarded. So if company valuation goes up, which in tech companies you hope is going to has an opportunity to dramatically go up, it generates value for employees who hold stock options and can be a huge incentive. And that potential upside can power startups in being able to compete against much wealthier organizations in the hunt for the best talent that's out there. So they can't offer the same salaries or benefits that you get at a bank or a Google or a corporate organization. But besides the mission, they can also offer this potential major upside on the stock options. And it's been a key element to powering Silicon Valley's success over the decades. Mm-hmm. And we're now, as part of getting the European ecosystem, as we gear up and become more mature, we're seeing them increasingly adopted in Europe. And as an international investor, we've seen how critical they are to successfully scaling companies, and we want to see that happen in Europe as well.
And on that note, then, I have a question for you all. Why do you really believe that Europe has been lagging behind the US on this special topic? Frank?
How much time do we have to answer this one? No, I mean there are a few elements to this. The first one is the wider understanding, and there is a lot of surveys asking also finance leaders or founders, and to which extent they think an employee stock option program is something which is very valuable, versus to which extent they think it's understood. And there is a huge discrepancy between the value that it brings along and the level of understanding. And this is, I think, only been solvable, or it's only going to be solvable with education. Mm-hmm. And talking about it and sharing insights and being transparent on valuations and latest developments and sharing also numbers with the team. So if you as a leader are not willing to be an open book to your employees, I wouldn't even start in the first place thinking about equity, because then it's kind of a disincentive or mismatch in terms of what you promise them to be delivered to them and what you tell them about it. But beyond that, there is a lot of complexity around. So we consider ourselves to be a pan-European company, and investing into equity is something that we want our employees to believe in as well. But if it comes to employees abroad, so France, UK, Spain, but also the US, it's just getting incredibly complex, because the German program, whether that's a German problem or not, doesn't work abroad, and vice versa. And then if you look at it from a administration point of view, it's great that there are tools such as Ledgy, but it's also the question of why does it need those tools in such extent? Because it's really difficult to administrate and to manage a larger workforce. And it's also a cost effect. Germans love to go to a civil law notary for those programs. And you ask yourself why. And then if you've solved all of that, you come to Texas. And you think of those who double down into the business and who buy into your business case and who want to support you as founders early on and join your company, they are taxed extremely disfavorable on the equity that you give them, and significantly heavier than the capital investors. So sorry for that one, Dom, but this is just not at equal terms, and we need a change, because we want those to join the team and to join the founders and who believe in what they're building to be successful at exit. And to tell everyone, look, this has been the right decision that I've made, and to bring back part of that what they gain to the ecosystem, and to build something what we see in the Silicon Valley, and to a certain extent also in the London ecosystem and tech team, which I haven't seen to that extent at scale somewhere else in Europe.
So it's a mix of awareness, tax, complicated international employees, but you do believe that we should be giving equity to employees.
100%. So when we launched the business, and we were thinking of which pool should we set aside, so we looked at the back then incubated Berlin models, and we felt like maybe it's a single-digit percentage point. We agreed, and we jointly decided to set aside almost 20% of the equity, because simply we said if it works, it doesn't matter, because actually it works because of the team that worked alongside us. But if it didn't work, it didn't matter either, because then there's nothing to distribute. So in either way, it's the right choice to make, and I believe it should be just more commonly used by every startup and scale-up across Europe and beyond.
Dominique, could you maybe share some insights about the European landscape on equity, and maybe we would focus on France, UK, and Germany. I know that Germany is especially tough in terms of equity.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So, I mean, overall, I mean, I sort of did a lot of benchmarking for the research that I did. Overall, when using what Frank said as well, US companies, by the time that they might go to IPO, if they've sort of scaled up to that point, over 20% on average of the fully diluted equity in one of those tech companies will be owned by employees, right? And that's excluding the founder. So, you think about these multi-billion-dollar exits, and you've got billions of dollars that are in the hands of employees and that can become liquid. So, it gives you a sense of the quantum. In Europe, it's closer to 10%, and there's much higher standard deviation on that, right? There's a lot more variability. It's quite a much more regimented model in the US, and best practice is being established. In Europe, it follows a lot more the philosophy of the founders. So, as Frank said, they were at the top end of being enlightened on this front, but there's companies in Europe which don't go for any stock options. But the average is out at this 10%. When you look between markets, I mean, I don't have enough data to sort of say country by country in Europe, but basically the single biggest determinant is the maturity of an ecosystem. The more mature the ecosystem is, the more likely it is that somebody you're trying to hire will know somebody or have a friend or have a contact who's done well out of stock options, or didn't get them in a big success and regretted it. And therefore they're going to be lobbying, and it's going to be important to them to receive them. They're going to know the value. So that maturity of ecosystem is the single biggest thing. So that's why I suppose in Europe, London's the furthest ahead. But Paris, Amsterdam, Berlin, etc., are then slightly behind that. But it also reflects then some of the policy things that Frank said. And in the book, actually, you sort of did a table of comparing the stock option practices of 22 different markets, and we came up with this ranking like this for different countries. And we go into some detail, but basically, you get countries including the UK and France, which are actually their stock option policies. They might differ in slight ways from the US approach, but they're actually overall more employee friendly, and they're robust, tax favorable, good systems. Frank can talk to it later, but there's all sorts of roadblocks in the way for Germany or Spain or Belgium. So we've got a real massive differentiation between the type of practices that you have across Europe and between countries.
Mm-hmm. Maybe also to add up on that one, on what you mentioned, Dominic, on the maturity of the ecosystem. I think this might sound obvious for some of the audience here, but maybe for others not. And I think it's a very important concept. So I think the central concept here is that if employees of a successful startup in the future take part into the success and get sort of rich overnight at an exit, they tend to actually reinvest their new wealth into the ecosystem again by either founding a startup themselves or investing in startups. And actually here, very interesting statistics that was released by the ASAP study on Monday from the German Startup Association. Apparently 38% of employees who have worked for startups have invested in the ecosystem again afterwards. So this is sort of a data that proves that. And so I think that in the US, this is sort of already very well working. And in Europe, we just need to, so we have already many great startups, and we just need to also bring the second ingredient to that virtuous circle, which is policy, make better policies to allow for these employee participation plans.
You can only want something that you kind of at least have a sense of realizing what the upside is. And if there is no one who could tell you that and how and to which extent he or she benefited from being part of such a program, it's hard for you to grasp. And a lot of the discussions that we're also having is we need to explain why we're giving this equity incentive and why we believe it's a truly aligning interest. And it's the greatest of goods that we can deliver to an employee, because it just means they become an entrepreneur at the point in time they sign up. but it also needs to be experienceable. And like giving back to the ecosystem, we're seeing successful like second line management or early wider management group co-founders in the widest sense of scheme, that after having had a successful exit say, you know what, I am in a position that I can try myself now, is the best you could get to in an ecosystem. And what that's kind of typical in the US, both East and West Coast, and it doesn't happen that frequently in Germany. And there is this kind of half true, half wrong saying in the West Coast, and what's the latest successful tech IPO in Germany? And then people answer SAP. So I disagree with that, but it kind of shows a bit of a perception on the readiness of the market to have those programs at scale.
Interesting. We're going to push 2 polls right now to know in the audience who has put in place equity incentives, and also where your company is from, and if you have an equity incentive plan, just to see maybe some discrepancies and variations between countries. What we can talk about now is maybe who decides basically to grant equity to employees. Like, what's the decision process? Like, is it the founders? Is it at one point the investors who just suggest to the founders? Is it the CFO who just wants to give shares everywhere? Like, how does it happen?
So yeah, maybe I can say a couple of things here. So the standard way in our experience, at least, and happy to also hear more about Frank's experience and Dominic's experience, but the way it is done is, first of all, I think the first desire to do this, to set up a pool for employees, has to come from founders. And then, of course, the investor come into the game, and especially the board. So you have to get board approval to set up this pool, allocate these stock options, and that's basically it, I would say. So it's really it comes from the founders or the management team in combination with the board / investors. And of course, if you want to increase the pool size, this also has to be agreed with new investors coming in at a new round, for example. And I think, yeah, that's also a very interesting topic here to speak about, because sometimes there are some conflicts here where investors say, oh, this pool is going to dilute us, so we don't want this. And I think here I'd be at least very interested in hearing from you, Dominic, how you see this in your experience. Like, have you ever had the case that you had maybe a co-investment where there were some frictions around pool sizes, and how did you go about it?
Happy to answer that. I mean, yeah, overall, yeah, things are changing, but we virtually never, as an investor, find ourselves in on the side of the table arguing that the pool shouldn't be as big as the founders or investors believe, because we've seen the benefits of having a large carve out ESOP for attracting and retaining top talent. So we're very rarely on that side. We do see sometimes it's from founders, but I'd say that has diminished over the years. Even the 8 years I've been at Index, there used to be quite a lot of founders who are like, well, employees aren't really asking for it, so why should I give it away, or what's the point of diluting all the rest of us? Very, very rarely hear that. And I suppose it's a bit of a proof point for us as an investor. If we had a founder who was making that argument to us, it wouldn't be a particularly great signal in terms of our likelihood of investing in them, because it suggests they don't get it. If you're going to build a really successful global business, etc., that isn't an attitude that's likely to get you very far. So that's one side. Investors, it really depends on the sophistication of investors. Happily, European investors are becoming more sophisticated overall. So the people who we're likely to share a slot place on the cap table with are less likely to say that, but yeah, it still does come up pretty regularly. And usually we have to sort of push hard and usually have the founder support, and we can sort of drive things through because we see it as extremely important. So I'd say things are moving in the right direction fairly quickly, but there are still probably laggard investors and perhaps unsophisticated investors that you find on the cap table are the most likely to be resistant.
And what would be what would be typical arguments that you would bring up in these cases, you know, to convince other investors to make a proper sized pool?
Well, yeah, we some of the things we said. I mean, I suppose some tangible points would be, you know, which I think are important for this debate overall. Often in Europe, it's less about it's partly around hiring the best people, but I actually think it's almost more about in Europe about retaining the best people, because you can often, outside of exec or senior hires, you can still get away in much of Europe with not offering a stock option program. But one of the dangers though, is that you can get away with it, but if you have some people who expect it, then are you going to set up a system where some people get options because they asked for it and demanded it, and other people don't? And like a key point of everything that we'd say is consistency and fairness is critical. So if you think you're going to have a situation where some people are going to be expecting equity, don't get yourself in a situation where say, well, only if you ask for it. Just that is a disaster, because that will leak out, and then it creates resentment, and actually it's negative for you. You're using your most valuable asset, using equity. It is your most precious asset, and yet it's creating negative goodwill in your team, not positive. So consistency and fairness is critical. Another very practical, what I mean in terms of the retention piece is, yeah, if you're successful, at some point in time, even if you're below the radar as a seed company or even a Series A, by the time you're like the size of like a Raisin or a Spendesk, you're known as being a great talent pool, and your people are going to be called up constantly with job offers, even from the likes of, you know, the big tech giants, as well as other startups. And if you haven't created a reason for them to stay with you, because you can guarantee that, you know, Google or a bank could offer twice the salary that you do. Even then, if you haven't created a moat as something to retain those people, you will lose people. Even if you've got a great mission and culture, it just becomes too attractive. So options are super important for retention. The more successful you are, the more important that is. And the second point is around US talent, that if you're going to be really successful and you scale and you ramp, you are likely to have to sort of bring in some individuals or leaders, depends on the type of business. But if you're building a global business, you're almost definitely going to have to involve US. And if you're doing that, again, the fairness and consistency thing comes up, because are you going to have a situation where your US team, where the market is different, are given options and potentially large amounts of options, whereas people in the European team who might have been there for longer don't have a stake in the business? And that can also create resentment and frustration. Or if you're relocating somebody from the US, you know, suddenly they're given a much more attractive offer than their peers sitting around the table with them.
Just chipping in, because when you asked and how do you convince other investors, then Dominic, at least in my read, we were struggling, because the convincing argument is kind of already insulting. Say you're a net scale company and you just did a round, and you would say, let us set aside an additional 2.5 or 3%. And then the argument the investor who is against would have to make is, I believe the 3% dilution of my stake is not caught up for by the talent you will hire with this over the years to come. So this is around the consumer price index inflation. So it's like, how would you argue against such an argument? It's so out of league. And then it's around the sophistication of the investor, basically. And you can't really argue otherwise than saying, if you don't believe the talent we are hiring over the next 4 years to retaining at the organization will at least yield a 3% return, then you shouldn't invest in us in the first place. So that's on the investor sophistication. And I mean, I had the pleasure to come across a few of the very, very early stage companies in Berlin, where on one or two I could be a very, very small business angel. And I've seen the same that you, Dominic, have said, that in terms of support, this is very heavily correlated with fund size and sophistication, which are a bit of the same argument in terms of understanding. And I agree, don't issue options because you think you have to, but because you need to be convinced in the first place that this is the right call to make to retain talent, and make sure your top talent is never fully vested. So even think about re-incentivizing them once it's been vested, and not saying, okay, now finally we got away with that person. No, you need to re-incentivize them. You need to keep them excited on board, because as you said, there is always someone else who's willing to pay a higher salary for that person, especially once you become a brand name in the space. And not doing it because you can get away without doing it will haunt you at a later stage. And so to the initial question, Christina, who is deciding on it? In the initial month or quarters, or maybe the first 1 or 2 years, it's a bit of non-consistent and ad hoc, and you understand you need to do something, and it's a bit of individual negotiation. But then exactly what Dom said is really, really important. You need to have consistency in place, because people talk about this, and you never want to have someone leaving just because he or she feels that she's not being treated in a way she or he should have been treated, because she wasn't like very outspoken about it. It's something that people expect from you as a transparent leader, that you try to at least find ballparks or logic or salary equivalents in which you grant out stock options in certain like seniority levels, because otherwise it'll sooner or later be realized that it's just not consistent across the organization.
Mm-hmm. Question for you, Frank. Can you explain what you have implemented at Raison? And you were talking about communication and how do you communicate about equity?
So we might be a bit of the odd one out, maybe because we didn't realize in the first place what this means in terms of administration complexity, but I would do it the same today. So we don't have a virtual stock option program, but we have an actual stock option program. So people can subscribe to common shares in the company. They are non-voting to not complicate governance, but it's actual shares. The benefit of such a program for the employee is obvious. He would become a shareholder, he'd receive dividends once we are profitable, but mainly they can sell shares at any point in time without us having to object or interfere. Now, then oftentimes the question is, why should employees sell shares? Well, it was part of their salary. So if they feel passionate about selling them, then let them sell. But the more important point is, as soon as you offer them to sell, they'll think of, wait a second, I am a non-institutional employee, non-professional investor, and someone wants to have my share. So firstly, it's actually really worth something, and it's not just Frank telling me about it. And secondly, if someone very institutionally savvy wants to have it, then I will not give it away at that price. So this is a very positive, actually value enhancement of the paper employees. And so that's why we implemented an actual stock option program. It comes at the downside of needing notarization. So yes, that's a bit of a hurdle, but I'm happy to take it if we fundamentally believe that we can incentivize the team alongside this. And secondly, it means just that shares are more flexibly comparable. And on the education part, so we provide training. We also have a yearly ESOP letter where we tell what has happened in the last year and how that has been reflected in investor valuation with all the needed caveats, because an outside valuation doesn't mean that this is the market price at a given point in time, but it helps people to understand and how they contribute to the value of their specific option held.
A very quick question for you, Frank. I don't know if that is true or not, but so I heard or I read that in Germany, actually, if you have real stock options and that employees want to exercise them and that you go to the notary for this, then literally if you're, I think, a GmbH, the notary has to sort of read out loud the contract for sort of every grant. Is that true or is that wrong?
That's German, and that's true. It's not on the exercise, it's on the grant. So if there is a subscription declaration within the document, without getting into too much legal details, it needs to be read out aloud, but it can be administrated. So we have 2 notarization days a year, and then he just reads out aloud one of the documents and then references and changes on the other one. It takes roughly 3 to 4 hours, but I again think it's time well spent to incentivize the team and getting them into the best pool that we believe is administratable. But yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, it's just, I think, the most sort of funny and crazy example of the admin hassle of stock options right now in Germany. Yeah, good to know that it's true.
We actually have a lot of questions about how to handle stock options that are virtual or real in the question tab that maybe we can pick on 1 or 2 right now, because it's kind of the moment. So we can maybe look at Hafed's Anush question. How does VSOP work when the employee is transferred to a subsidiary outside of Germany in terms of vesting and tax for employee and employer? Do you know anything about that, Frank?
So, I mean, as we were running an actual stock option program, so an ESOP, ultimately that then depends on whether it's a part-time relocation or a full-time relocation to another country. If it's just part-time, it doesn't necessarily have an effect, because the point in time where you exercise is the point in time the tax authorities would look at this. And then your country where you're actually subject to social security contributions and employers and employee taxes defines the treatment. There is many ways that this is not complicated. So we have a few employees who also went abroad for permanent establishments in southern and eastern Germany, where it wasn't a problem. If that specific country in question would have been France, it could have been complicated, because then both the German and the French tax authority, if it's not a structured program as the PSCPE, would have actually claimed the capital gains to be taxed. Unfortunately, not at capital gains, but as employment income. So it a bit depends on where you're moving to. The problem is that in Germany, in Europe, there shouldn't be a difference. So if we want to believe that we're a common market for labor, then this shouldn't matter at all. It just should be the same treatment regardless of where you move to. Unfortunately, not, neither for ESOP nor for.
You talked about this concept of European equity passport. And Yoko, you shared the fact that France had improved their BSPC policy this year, and it wasn't really the same in Germany, although they did launch something recently. Could you maybe share more about that? Frank, maybe more, or Dom, just how the landscape is changing and this concept of passport.
Okay, I'm happy to step in on that. Yeah, I mean, as part of the not optional work that we're doing on the policy side, we're having a lot of these conversations at the moment. So we inputted a lot into the change you mentioned in France at the beginning of the year in the finance bill, which meant that the tax favorable scheme, which has been available to French startups for many years, which are called BSPCEs. It's a very, very good scheme, but it was only open to companies which had a French topco originally, and has seen that being an issue with a lot of our companies and our portfolios, who'd been trying to setting up subsidiaries in France, hiring people in France, not being able to offer stock options at all, because BSPCEs weren't open to them, and it was a real impediment. And it also created a perception of the French ecosystem as being, not open to investment, not open for business. So it's great to see the administration make that change, so that now BSPCEs can be issued when the company isn't just a French topco. We're now working with a number of other governments in across Europe. We've been with Ireland, with Netherlands, with some engagement with Germany, Sweden, lots of different countries working with, and also at the Commission level. But I mean, I think being realistic, we know that these type of policy changes are never exactly at startup speed. So the changes will be quite slow and gradual, but we've got something on the proposals for this Parliament. So this session of the European Parliament has adopted a series of measures around a sort of standard, a startup nation standard sort of idea, and having portability and recognition, mutual recognition between member states of stock option schemes is one of the things which is part of that passport. So hopefully that will start to sort of create some pressure on this, but it's going to be multiple years rather than months away, being realistic.
Okay. We do have another question from Tim Fisher on stock options in Germany. When giving real stock options in Germany, does the employee have to pay the current price of the share at issue?
It is actually linked to the question from Lauren Oberholzer on the understanding and managing downside risk and exercising the option. So me not being a tax advisor, but stating the following: the grant of an option as such is a non-taxable event. However, if you exercise the option, the delta between the market value, however you come up with it, and the actual strike price to be paid is being taxed, and it's taxed at the employment income tax rate, which is the highest you could probably end up with. So in that sense, it just generates a dry income, which you would have to pay tax on, and also social security contributions. And that's not something you would want to encourage your employee to do, because obviously in scale-up, there is a risk of a valuation downturn, or even an event where there isn't a liquidity event at all, in which case there wouldn't be any weak fallback of the tax authority being paid. So the granting of options works, but unfortunately, to get it into the capital gains section, you need to exercise, which means immediate taxation. And that's the kind of flaw of the system, because then ultimately, for the multiple years of work of a very early joiner, you'll be taxed in 1 year in a progressive tax rate. That's not great, because you end up in the highest bracket, and you're taxed in the highest possible type of income, which is employment income.
Okay, and what then should entrepreneurs, CFO be careful about when setting these schemes? Any advice? Dom?
I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah.
I mean, a couple of things, be careful about. I mean, I'll just mention two, and other, Yoko and Frank can throw in others. One, generally it's around being, when you set up the plan rules, often the lawyers that you're working with are not particularly well versed. They don't get the big picture, and so lawyers will, understandably try and do things which are in their client's interests and make sure that schemes are structured in the way which is most favorable to a company. But that's in quite a narrow definition of just what's most favorable in terms of giving them get-out clauses, ability to claw back, giving them ability to sort of, claw back if somebody leaves the company, etc. All these different things. And I think the strategic point here is, tactically that might feel sensible, and your lawyer might be urging you to do that. But the whole point is that if employees think that your stock option scheme, or have evidence to feel that your stock option scheme is weighted against them, it will be seen as bullshit. Basically, it will be seen as like, this isn't real, and especially if you have situations where people leave the company and they're not allowed to exercise, they're treated as a bad leaver or whatever, and even vested shares don't happen, it creates a real cynicism. And then I just say, well, what's the point of giving away 10-15% of your company's equity if it's just seen as either a bit of a joke, or seen as cynically as something, we'll never actually see anything out of this. I mean, you've given up your most precious asset for zero return. Actually, it's created a negative feeling. So basically, be generous. I think Levers is a great example of that, because very few, if you're a successful startup, very few of your early employees are going to be there all the way through to a big exit. Mm-hmm. But those people were a real key part of your journey. They're critical to your success. So treat them generously. And then they will, if they're able to exercise, they become shareholders. They become advocates outside the organization. They become valuable alumni. They can help you to continue the growth. Mm-hmm. And it will create a good feeling of goodwill and reality inside the organization with the rest of the employees, that they're not going to get treated badly. So that's like, I think, my overarching piece. I think related to that, if you have an opportunity, because you're doing well as an organization, to have some employee secondary. So if you have, like, you're doing a fundraise, you have extra interest from investors, if you can do some secondary, maybe this is a Series B or C sort of stage, it's terrifically positive if you have employees participating in that, or being allowed to participate, because it suddenly turns what is an intangible, at some point it might be worth something, into some real money and some real financial upside if they can, if people with vested shares can exercise a portion of them and sell some of them. It suddenly makes the whole thing real. It's like, hey, actually there's real money here, and gets people excited. There's no greater signal. And again, that magnifies and leverages the options that you've granted, because it makes them real. And anything you can do for that, to demonstrate that, is hugely positive. So those are a couple of points I won't yabber on. Please.
I couldn't agree more. So also on the secondary piece, and the question on whether you're entitled to keep vested portions. So this is just N=1 in our way of doing it. Everyone is entitled to keep the options when leaving, even if it's only partially. So those parts which are vested. And equally, if there was a secondary, they are equally entitled to sell down. There is no need for them to wait. They deserve them. They earned them. They work for us. They build Raisin with us, alongside us. Why not offering them the opportunity to sell along? Because ultimately, it just generates the proof of value for junior share classes in your cap table. Secondly, it is also starting to build an ecosystem where people benefit from being participators in the equity stack of a company they work for. And thirdly, on the program and do's and don'ts, with Dom on that one. So what I would say is, think of what could someone who succeeds in your role as a managing director at some distant future point, appreciating that might never happen due to the program and its beneficiaries, if he stepped into your role, given the way the program is set up. Could he be very detrimental to those who have already been basically incentivized? Or is the program crystal clear and tells what to do and what not to do? And if it's the latter, then it's great. And if not, then rework the program.
Yeah, here actually, on my side, the first thing is what we do at Ledgy for our own ESOP is that, so we also have stock options. We're based in Switzerland. And we also allow stock option holders to also exercise even after they left the company, however, with a time frame. So I think it's around 2 years. In the US, I think it's very standard to have also, a couple of months after you leave to exercise. Mm-hmm. But definitely important to leave this option open, or this possibility open, no pun intended, and to allow employees to exercise and to live in a good way. And actually, the second thing that came to my mind about being careful, I think it goes back to the point that Dominique mentioned before, about how you communicate about the equity. So meaning being fair and transparent. I think that's something you should be super careful about, that we also do at Ledgy, that we just really have a table saying, look, this is the formula, so that you just have to be careful about how you communicate this to the whole team.
I'd throw in one other sort of thing, because it hasn't come up so far, and just at least until you're a couple hundred people as an organization, I think we're big proponents that everybody in the organization, every employee, should get at least some stock options, even if it's a very small allocation, which is partly around the whole, it partly reflects the sort of democratic sort of tech ideal of like everybody's aligned and it feels like an owner. So it's partly around that, but there's also a sort of very practical point, which, because the importance of education and communication has come up several times in this conversation. And it is absolutely critical. And if you're giving stock options to some people, but not everybody, it really limits your ability to communicate to your employees and to educate around what they are. And suddenly you can't mention them at all hands, or you've got to have some subgroup or some sub-channel of people who have got stock options. We'll tell them, or we'll train them, but not others. Which again is feels undemocratic, like anti-startup culture, but it also just very practically just makes it harder if you can't be open. So even if the most junior people in the organization have got just a small handful, just practically speaking, it makes the job that much easier in education.
One last part and theme that I want to talk about was the impact of the current crisis on equity landscape and culture. And do you think that the sad fact that people have been laid off in the US, for example, will be a chance to kind of rebalance things with Europe? Like attracting the talent, removing bottlenecks right now. Dom?
Okay. Fundamentally, I don't think that's necessarily going to happen, because sort of there's a supply-demand thing. Stock options, the more valuable talent is, the more it's a seller's market for talent, so to speak, then the stronger the motivation to give generous compensation, including stock options, right? So if you've got a lot of unemployment, talent market becomes a bit more loose, that doesn't necessarily mean stock options. The one thing I have seen from I've seen a number of companies and startups do is in this crisis is, trying to push your cash runway out, trying to conserve cash. I've seen companies do things like, well, we can't afford, or we don't think it's a smart idea to give salary increases in the way that we might have in the past because we're trying to conserve cash. So we'll give an additional equity award in lieu of cash and explain that to our employees. So it's using your equity as an alternative to cash when you're trying to conserve cash. So I've seen that a number of times. I think that's one direct consequence of the crisis. But I don't think more broadly, I haven't seen much on that front.
This session has been recorded, right?
Yes. Okay,
perfect. So then I personally think the acting president, Mr. Trump, has done a better job on bringing talent to Europe than COVID will ever do. And besides that, I think it's a bit of a question, to be very honest, in short-term versus long-term. Investors signing up in a business like Raisin, again, not yet profitable, high growth, spanning multiple countries, markets, products, customers, they buy into our vision of building a pan-European and even at some point in time US assets-based business and not in like short-term stock market volatility. And even on that, you might argue that indices, despite the shenanigans of some of the larger companies in Germany, are above the level a year ago. So you haven't even seen a massive downturn on the equity markets for the right or wrong reasons. But in terms of E-stock, this is really a long-term view that investors take back in companies like us or also spenders and Lecce. So in that sense, I don't think there is much volatility on the E-stock in the longer run. It might just be extremely harder to raise capital this year if you have.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and maybe to add on this as well, I think this point was a little bit touched also by Dominic, but like the idea that fundamentally, in a crisis, you're short on cash, so the equity becomes even more important. That's one thing, and also from our experience with our users, we see sort of like the main trend here is to sort of set, the crisis is now, but to set the focus on the long term and bring actually more transparency in this in among the employees. So we see actually a strong desires from startups to, especially in this crisis, to set the importance on ownership in the company. So that's one thing. Of course, there are also some who sort of where it's really bad economically, so they have other topics than employee participation plans they have to focus on. But generally, I think it's the crisis to me is more of a chance than a bad thing for the topic of ownership in Europe.
There's a question from Timo. Do many companies already offer secondary transactions to sell their equity pre-IPO exit? Anyone who wants to answer? Go.
The many companies part can only be answered plausibly by Dominic.
Yeah, I mean, well, as you can expect, in the US, very, very common, right? Even like, where we usually push back is that I think the dynamics are slightly changing now because of the crisis, but you were getting Series A investments where founders were saying, okay, I want to sell a chunk of secondary. And you're like, hang on, this is a little bit early in the journey to talking about secondary. But so that might be a situation where we push back. From Series B onwards, if the business is doing well, then we can see the value, because then you might have some early employees who are fully vested, and that's when you can start to sort of unlock that motivational benefit. And there's some real upside in the share price as well. It feels very tangible. Our general, in terms of Europe, we see it, I think as the investment landscape is getting more competitive in Europe, you're getting it more common because you're more likely to have, you can't have secondary unless you've got excess investor demand, right? So that's a sine qua non for secondary. So when you do, you are likely to have investors who say, hey, I want to increase my ownership percentage, or can we have a way into the cap table through some secondary? And that might be employees, or it might be angel investors who might be interested in selling down. But if there is secondary offer to founders, one of the things that you can't impose it, but we are very, very in favor of, if founders are going to sell any secondary, that employees should as well. That shouldn't be one-sided, that just the founders get the chance, but not other employees. That's quite important to us. But yeah, so from Series B onwards, I think we think it's a positive thing to see.
The last question from Simon. If you have some questions, guys, feel free to shoot them now. Simon Cox is asking, what would be the best way to offer equity to US employees of European headquartered companies? Frank?
Well, that's an almost impossible to answer question in 4 minutes. It depends a bit on the structure and whether there is a US incorporation or it's a permanent establishment, and where the headquarters in Europe are. I mean, we do have US business on the ground with a separate inc. in the US, so it's New York, and there we do grant restricted share units, which are similar to the options in Germany and also taxed upon exit or at the time of exercise. So it's similar, and also the US is not a low-tax country, you realize at that point in time. But that depends a bit on the structure between Europe and the US. The one thing we came across, though, as a realization is you can't simply use your existing European program because it will most likely be prohibitively taxed.
Yeah, agreed. There is the in terms of talent in the US, you either, I think it's very difficult to offer, even if you had a virtual scheme in the US, that's not going to fly. They're like going to be, what the hell is this stuff? They expect to see either an RSU scheme, as Frank mentioned, or a US type of stock option program. And there is a tax favored one and a non-tax favored one. And although the differences are not dramatically large, it's not that difficult to set up the tax favored one, which is called an ISO scheme, as long as you've got a US incorporated subsidiary or topco. You can do that. There are some things, no point going into detail, you have to get valuations. You can offer stock options under those programs at a discount to the most recent pref price that was paid by investors. So there are things that make those really extra valuable to employees. But going into the mechanics of those is probably not beyond the scope of this call. But it's not that difficult. But it does cost a certain amount of money.
So we've been on for 57 minutes. Oh, Tim Fisher, last question. Any advice on percentage of shares to grant to different levels in the business to make a program fair? Interesting questions. We didn't talk about this at all.
So immediate reply would be, don't think in percentage, think in value. Because at a later stage company, if you think of the large tech giants in the US, they're long gone thinking even like the third or fourth, behind the decimal point digit, they think basically in value, and that value is, I think, best driven by what would be a top-notch market salary for that kind of a type of profile, and to which extent can you come up to that level by offering stock options, because you won't be able to match the salary in cash.
Mm-hmm. I'll chuck in a plug here again. So alongside the Rewarding Talent book that I mentioned before, we also developed an app called Option Plan, which you can get to where the book is on our website, or just optionplan.com, which is it's a pretty easy to use app for helping you design allocations bottom up for different levels and functions in your startup. There's a seed version and a venture version. The venture version holds true for Series A, B, or C. Actually, I've sort of stress tested it for all, and it's based on actual benchmarks in terms of what those allocations are. So I think it gets about 250 users a day, this tool, right? So yeah, between rewarding talent and that, it's becoming a pretty good benchmarking tool across Europe for ensuring that you're offering a fair program which is competitive with the market.
Yes, and this guide is really great. We've also checked it out and based our own plan on this as well. No, this is really super helpful. I think it's great. But also to add on this, I think the three main dimensions to consider to you know, make this plan at your company is first of all, I think the seniority. The second would be also the employee number. So sort of the earlier employee will get more because they take a higher risk by joining the company. And the third dimension would also be tech and non-tech. And this is actually just related to the market demand. So it is a fact that, you know, technical talent is simply more in demand nowadays, and therefore there is a certain difference there in stock options as well.
Cool, thanks. If you guys, we're just over an hour, so we're gonna finish like 2 minutes, but if you wanna just give one advice to the audience, what would it be? If we can start with Yoko.
Sure. So I've thought a bit about that, about, you know, this whole webinar we're doing here, and I think for me, the way we can democratize more equity in European startups is actually three things. And the first is really the policy, and it's great that we have not optional campaigns, or campaigns like not optional or ESOP, ASAP. The second one is really processes, and that's also what motivates me at Ledgy, you know, to build a great software to manage this. And the last but not least is really the education. And there I think, you know, you listening here, leaders of startups, you should definitely educate your employees not only on the hard facts, so the mechanics of stock option plans, but also most importantly, being very transparent about the context. So what are the values of the stock the employee own? How it is going to develop? What is a realistic scenario? What is a moonshot scenario? And really providing context to all the owners of your company.
Thanks, I love that. Thanks, Yoko. Frank?
I would just say take the pain and do it, because there are so many reasons to find arguments not doing it, but nothing which can be an equally good incentive and retaining and enforcing mechanism for companies that reach scale than granting ownership.
Thanks. Dom?
Okay, yeah, it's +1 on all the points that Yoko and Frank said, for sure. And I suppose if I was going to add in something else, it would just be reinforcing this point around consistency and fairness. Like, you know, just reinforcing this point. Yeah, when you allocate equity, it is your most, so make sure that there's a dramatically positive impact on motivation and retention and hiring. But if it's done in a way that is perceived as unfair or not real, then it goes into reverse, and it can actually be a negative drag. So, you know, be consistent, be fair, ideally offer it to all employees, something to everyone, don't do any of those clawbacks, etc. And then it can be really enhancing of your overall employer brand, employer value proposition. And the CFOs or finance leaders having that more strategic, enlightened approach, and not being swayed by what so much by what, and keeping that in mind rather than thinking about what your lawyer might be advising you or your accountant or whoever helps you structure the program. Be strategic about this, because that's how you're going to build a really, truly world-class and winning organization.
Great advice. Thank you, Dom, Frank, and Yoko, for being with us today. I really hope that you enjoyed the conversation and that the audience learned a lot. I certainly did. So thanks for joining us. Thanks to you guys behind your screen for joining us today. It was amazing to be with you tonight. And we will share the recording of the event to everyone that attended or registered, and we will also write a blog recap so you can find all the learnings. So thank you again, and we will share all the different links that Dom talked about, led you to, Frank maybe. We'll share all that we can share on this topic. So thanks everyone for joining, and bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.